think Garbage That Got Us started, there's maybe 60 devotees. At the end of Garbage That Got Us, there was about 150 devotees in the community, in Adidam community.
And a lot of people have seen those, the scenes of the ecstatic experiences people are having and howling and all that and going into all sorts of yogic poses. I know experience itself, the whole point of it was that experience is not the point. However, I think it's important for people to know what exactly was going on in the body mind for you at those times.
So I remember going out to the LA community, and I'm sitting there in the hall with another devotee there, and the guy is having Kriyas, which are body movements, shakings. And I see the guy going like this. And I'm looking at him from the side, and I say, now I know Adi Da said that's not the point, but I want that. I want to have experiences too. I want something to happen. And when Adi Da would look in your eyes, there was this beam of light that would come out of his eyes into you. And he might look in your eyes for a minute or two as he'd go around the room, or he'd go work with the energy above your head, and you would feel it coming into you. And by the time you moved to the next person, you were swimming in energy. You were swimming in this yogic force. And it could cause Kriyas. And there were a variety of Kriyas. There was one that I often experienced, which was a kink in the neck when the energy came down the front and went up the spine, and your neck would go like this. That was a Kriya. And another Kriyas where the hands would go up. There were times when I would meditate and the energy would come down the front, go up the back, go through the neck, and my whole brain would be full of light. The whole brain would just be full of light. Just this incredible feeling of and it's very blissful. But you come down, you come out of that, and you go back to your room, and you knock your toe against the door, and it's just the same old stuff. And you see that it didn't really change you. That's not the point. That the ego and the understanding the self-contraction and the turning was the point.
Yeah.
And so it was a long lesson for all of us to get that. And Adi Da talked about how before we were egos wanting to have spiritual experiences, but now we're egos having had spiritual experiences, and it made no difference. And that lesson was given to the whole community. And it's not that we didn't all have to go through it. I mean, anytime, if I would have a great spiritual experience now, there's a tendency to want to cling on to it and make it happen again, make it happen all the time. But there's something about an insight into that that's clear in me and clear in the community altogether, to not make experiences the point. And around Adi Da, because he was so yogically alive, there was always spiritual experiences. There are now for people, they sit in his company. But yes, I had many experiences and many samadhis, intuitions of Amritanadi, moments of what felt like Nirvikalpa Samadhi, many kind of experiences like that. Yet, I'm still really, when it comes down to it, a beginner who's still working through the issues in the first 3 stages of life. But I'm not going to be distracted by that stuff.
Did those experiences aid in your practice or your daily intuition of the divine, or your feeling response to Adi Da in any way?
They engender in you a kind of an urge or to know about the reality of the spiritual process, and they increase your desire to really practice so that those things can be true of you as your actual state, not experiences. So it gives you that kind of impetus that way to know about that reality. But in and of themselves, the yogic transformation in them is only minor. I mean, Adi Da pointed out that people like myself and all of us who were there in those early years who had lots of spiritual experiences probably would not have that many spiritual experiences as we progress, because the channels were already open. I mean, really, a Kriya is the spiritual energy moving up against a blockage. And then the Kriya, the movement, is because it's When it's open, you don't need to do that. And so people who were through at that period of time, went through that period of time with Adi Da, don't necessarily have to have so many spiritual experiences, and they're not the point. And, you know, in my service in India, for example, or there was a time when Adi Da sent me out as a missionary kind of diplomatic person to go meet Swami Muktananda, 1979. And I was going to end up spending an hour or two talking to Swami Muktananda on the first occasion. And as soon as I saw him, he kind of zapped me with all these spiritual energies. And I, because I'd been through garbage and goddess, I was like, whatever, you know, whatever. I'm not here to be having blisses or spiritual experiences. There's something we're going to talk about. And, you know, and it didn't like dissuade me or somehow fascinate me or move me off my mark. And I've had the opportunity to meet many different spiritual teachers, and that dimension of things, the fact that there may be spiritual energy about them, has never distracted me. Even when I go to India and go to temples and there's lots of maybe energy there, it's not the point. My practice is the point. My turning to Adi Da is the point. Don't have to look, as he says, to the left or the right. I can just stay focused. So that kind of clarity has been there as a gift from having been through all that.
So if it's not the actual spiritual experiences, like the various yogic phenomena that are making the difference in your life and the change in your heart from being the self-possessed character that we all are to being God-possessed. What was it about the relationship with Adi Da, any kind of lessons that he had for you that actually made that transformation? You mentioned you were interested in Adi Da because he could actually deal with you on a life level. You know, what was that process for you like as a young man in the community?
Well, all of us that were around Adi Da in the early days, and particularly those who he presumed to be his intimates, and the way he described it is he said he worked with a few people that were his intimates as a way of working with everybody. And at the beginning, there weren't that many people, but then when there got, you know, when I came in, there was maybe 40, 50 devotees, and, you know, now there's a few thousand, you know. So I watched it grow, and Adi Da obviously couldn't work intimately with all that many people after a while. But as an intimate of his, everything was up for grabs. So he could point anything out to you, and you appreciated it. Maybe not in the moment, but you appreciated it soon after. And so the basic thing that he established first, which I talked about, was the love relationship to him, the recognition of him. One day he said to me, it was like 4 a.m. We were at the Manor of Flowers, and he was giving this ecstatic talk just full of his divine city. And he was talking about how amazing it was that we were just even existing as we were. He says, look at these curtains arising in the midst of infinity. Look at an argyle sock in the midst of infinity. And he was bringing you into this, you know, just the wonder that anything exists at all. And then he looked over at me and he goes, James, he says, you know who I am. He says, I'm going to expect great things of you in the future. And it was kind of, I'm only 22 at this point. It was kind of thrilling for him to say that to me. But the next day I was like, what the heck? And another person who was there came up to me and said, so what about that? I said, I don't know who he is. He says, well, who would you say he is? I say, I would tell you one thing. He's not an ego. He's not an ordinary human being. He has come from another kind of dimension, from another kind of realm, another God place. He says, well, that's it. He says, that's what I said, well, I can't tell you who that is. He says, no, but that. He said, just that. And so he established that first. And it was a while. There were times when he would sit in darshan with me, and I would feel so much energy in me that it would scare me. And again, I was raised Jewish, but I was saying, is he the Antichrist? Because it would push up against things in me, fears in me, and all this energy and this power. It wasn't like an ordinary person. I mean, in Garbage to Goddess, I saw him wave his hand, and I saw clouds move across the sky. I mean, I saw it with my eyes. It was a physical thing. I was in rooms with him in which a very thin layer of like rain came down in the room. That was like spiritual city, that you could feel it on you. Not enough to get you wet, but enough to get you a tiny bit like all tingly from the moisture of it. I mean, he was a miracle. I saw miracles like that all the time with him. So I saw that dimension of him. I saw his, which, you know, later on at the end of Garbage to the Goddess, he said he's just going to stay as the heart. He's just going to be present as the heart. But I got that. I finally got beyond the Antichrist. What happened was I would have this great experience with him on the weekend. And at that point, it was before the bookstore even opened. And we were working on the bookstore. And I had a job in a natural food store as the produce guy. So I'd be putting up the lettuce, you know, and I'd be putting out the cabbage and, you know, and I'd be going, what happened last weekend? I'd go into the walk-in. What was that about? I felt like it was the divine, but there's nothing now. I don't feel anything. What was that? Was that just a trick? And I went through that weekend after weekend for about 3 or 4 weekends until while he was looking at me, I saw that doubt mind. I saw that mind that was doubting it, and I saw it as my own activity. And at that moment, something strengthened in me in my practice, where I understood that the difference between seeing him or feeling him in any moment and doubting him was my own action. And at that point, I could be more steady. It wasn't that I was steady all the time, but at that point, I knew when I started to go into a cycle of self-doubt and lack of practice and turning away that I needed to get myself straight again. So once that was the case, and once he had my love there and my recognition of him there, then there were many personal lessons in which he would point out things to me that I needed to change or transform about myself, that where I was full of shit, and things that he pointed out to me that were my tendencies that needed to be undermined. I mean, there was, to give you for instance, there was the day when I loaned a book to one of the ladies in his household. It was the Vajra Tantra, an expensive book. And in the middle of it, I put a 3x5 index card. Please make sure you get this book back to me. This is a very special book to me. Okay. And she apparently had left the book on the couch in Adi Da's house. And he had picked up the book and the card had come out. And I got notes from Adi Da about my obsession with books and owning books and my relationship to books and using books as if they were somehow a way of holding power, or somehow fetishistically, if I have the book, I have that knowledge, and using them as a hedge between me and him. And I was working at the bookstore and I was always buying him books, yet he was pointing out how I was in wrong relationship to books. And I got 3 different calls that day with increasing intensity in which he finally said, this is between James and me. It's book matter. And if James had any straightness about him, he would take every book that he owned and put them in the library. And he's not to own any books anymore. He can sell books. He can use books for research. He can give me books, but he's not to own any books because he has, until he understands something, he's got a wrong relationship to books. And that night, I went home and I unloaded my big bookshelf of about 4 big boxes of books, took them over to the library, carried them. My library was on the 3rd floor of each helper, that big building there at the sanctuary, and dropped off all 4 books and came home to no books. And that served me so much.
Did you indeed immediately feel that you were using the books as a kind of a barrier between you and actually releasing yourself to the divine?
I could see how it was a hedge. I could see how the books that I had was kind of like me thinking I had some personal power by being involved with these books and this knowledge and knowing something about this subject.
Yeah.
And exotic the book, you know, Tibetan this or that, or the more like special knowledge of esoteric stuff I had. And yes, I could see that it was there. And it took a number of years again before. I mean, he would come into my office after that and look and see how many books I had and because he said I got books for my research, you know?
So it's interesting the word recognition that you mentioned, recognizing who he is. And for a lot of, not a lot, but some people that I've encountered who aren't formal devotees, and even some who became formal devotees, reading Adi Da's word when he is very explicit in communicating who he is, you know, I am reality, I am real God, and his admonition that people recognize him. So for someone who doesn't have any understanding of what he's talking about, it could definitely seem like I am this great being, acknowledge how powerful I am, but that's not the recognition, obviously, that makes any kind of difference in someone's life, right? So what is it about recognition of who he is that is working at the level of your heart and your practice in relationship with the divine?
Yeah. So it's a word that Adi Da used pretty much maybe the last 10 or 15 years of his life. You wouldn't have found that word. I mean, he would have talked about satsang prior to that, or maybe communion, or feeling. It's a specific word that he came to appreciate and to give a very different meaning. Like you can look at me and see that I'm James, and I can look at you and see that you're Max. That's not recognizing him. Just to know, look at his picture and see it's Adi Da. Recognizing him is to feel something of, he used to talk about his body, you know, and his presence, and then his state of realization. And the recognition process has to do with feeling kind of all of that. It's just to recognize him is to see that he's not just an ordinary person. And in the spiritual traditions we were talking before, I mean, that's been kind of, my life has been to study the spiritual different traditions. And they say in the spiritual traditions that the greatest quote unquote sin or wrong thing you can do with your spiritual teacher is to see him as an ordinary person. So recognition has to do with the fact that to see that in the master's case, he's transcended the ego. These are all words we're using because the process of recognition isn't really about any words. I couldn't say anything to get anybody to get them to recognize Adi Da. Everyone has to recognize Adi Da or any spiritual master on their own. And it's when you see the person and you get who they are. That's beyond just, I mean, people can look at a picture of Adi Da, they can say, what a beautiful old man, you know? They could look at his picture and when he's overweight and say, wow, he's really a heavy person, and not get anything. When I'm in India, usually, where they have more of a tradition of spiritual masters, I pull out Adi Da's picture and more people stop and go, wow. They can look at the picture and see that that's a great spiritual being. But when that happens, and it can happen at any moment, you can get that. A lot of times the recognition process happens when people are studying Adi Da's book. They read his book and all of a sudden they realize, reading his teaching, this isn't an ordinary person saying this. I can feel a spiritual person there. I once was going to see this guy who was one of the great, he was a Korean, and he was a painter, a Zen painter. He was a Zen monk and he was a painter. His name was the Mad Monk. And there are a couple of books published of his paintings, a very famous Korean painter. And I was talking to him about Adi Da and showing him Adi Da's picture. And he was being very polite, and we were working through a translator, and he was being very polite. And then I showed him some pictures that Adi Da had drawn. And all of a sudden his face broke up in a gigantic smile. And he picked up the picture, he took it out of my hands, picked up his picture and ran around the room with it, put it on his head. And then he said through the translator, I can recognize from this picture, or he probably didn't use that word recognize, but I can tell from this picture that this is a divinely realized person, an enlightened person, a bodhisattva, whatever words he used to indicate it. I can tell it from the picture. The picture lets me know. And he recognized it from the picture. There's one devotee I know who was listening to Adi Da on the radio and heard Adi Da laugh. and he was in an apartment in San Francisco. He ran back and told his wife, "I've just discovered the avatar." And she said, "What do you mean you discovered the avatar?" He says, "No one can laugh like that except a totally free avatar." And that's what he got it from Adi Da's laugh. There's no way to know when somebody might get it. And I told you, when I first saw that picture of Adi Da, I didn't recognize him at all. I thought that, look at this guy from LA, a surfer dude. Once you have recognized him, then the process of the relationship with him can really begin. The process, that recognition has to do with the fact that he's not an ego, but he's someone who has transcended his ego. And by transcending his ego, then the divine light, or the divine that always is, comes through him. And once I was on a panel with a group of people in Little Rock, Arkansas, and this man who was a professor there said, "I've read some of Adi Da's books, and I can see that he's a real spiritual person. And sometimes I really feel a lot when I read the books. But my question to you is the light always on?" He said, "Is he always like that?" And real recognition comes when you're not like I was telling you, seeing him some moments, but then thinking he's the avatar after that. Real recognition when it comes to a depth that you get, that's who he is, day in or day out. That's who he is if he happens to be shouting. That's who he is if he happens to be eating. That's who he is if he happens to be teaching, if he's meditating. He's always that way. It's not like he comes out and meditates and turns it on and then goes back to his room and he's watching TV or something. It's always there. And that's a deeper recognition. And I can't say that my recognition of Adi Da is perfect. I think perfect recognition, you could say, would be coincident with enlightenment. Perfect recognition.
And that's a really interesting idea or understanding. And if you could just describe your understanding of what that means itself, of what perfect recognition, why perfect recognition of Adi Da would be coincident with realization.
Well, it's a matter of you. In other words, the thing that he's realized, which is, he calls it the bright, and he uses the symbol of the palm out as the bright. It's this radiant and transcendental condition, and he uses both words. The transcendental has to do with the consciousness dimension, and the radiant has to do with the energetic dimension. And the realization is radiant and conscious both. He calls it conscious light in that film that was made about him. So another term that he uses a lot. And so that condition, that is something that every devotee has intuitions of that. Right from the beginning, the first moment of recognizing him, you intuit that same condition. But you're still ordinary people like myself. We're still practicing. Sometimes you're like this, but other times you're doing this. And perfect recognition would be to be always like that.
Yeah.
Would be always like that. That's perfect recognition. It's complete responsibility for the self-contraction, where the self-contraction is instantly undone. And so anything that you do in life, you could have any emotion, but you're free in the midst of it. Because Adi Da uses this description, and he says it's not conditional. It's not based on conditions. It's non-conditional. In other words, realization is of a state that's prior to any arising, whether anything arises or not. It's there. It's there through your death. It's there at all times. This was a second book that I did. It was called Divine Distraction. And it's based on that principle that it's revealed. In other words, what can you do to recognize him? Or what can you do? We were talking about this versus that. What can you do? And you really can't do anything. It's really, the ego can't lift itself up by its own bootstrap, is the way Adi Da would describe it. But attraction, or the revelation, you have to do the action of the practice, but it's only made true by grace.
Mm-hmm.
It's only that makes the practice true. And so you were talking earlier about what is the conceit of the talking school versus the practicing school. And there's a lot of people these days. I was asked to answer a question that was on one of the Adidam website talk forums, with somebody who wanted to know, since we're all God, why do we have to do the practices? And that's a very common misunderstanding now, because as you say, yes, it's all true, but how do you realize that? And so even though the gift is given, the revelation is given by Adidam, the bright is given, still practice frees up energy and attention so that you can go deeper and let go more and practice more. So any moment in itself is true, but the practice helps to make more of those moments.